What's going on, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So yesterday saw a major blow to those who still believe the U.S. doesn't have a two-tiered justice system. See, despite the fact that not a single banker faced trial for their role in the 2009 financial crisis, nearly 8,000 activists were arrested during the Occupy protests. Now, most of those charges were eventually dropped, but one activist named Cecily McMillan wasn't so lucky. According to McMillan, on the night of March 17, 2012, her breast was grabbed from behind by a police officer named Grantley Bovell. She instinctively responded by elbowing Bovell in the face and shortly suffered a seizure, as shown in the video, shortly thereafter, rather. Well, after an absurdly long, drawn-out process, yesterday, McMillan was found guilty of second-degree assault, meaning that she could face up to 7 years in prison. Back in February, two of Cecily's supporters came on the show to discuss why the city of New York had invested so much time and money in the case and what a guilty verdict would mean.
Really what they're trying to do, at least in my belief, is show that you can't really protest legally anymore. Like, you really can't go to a protest and be safe. Which is really scary. So if they could successfully put Cecily in jail for the 2 to 7 years that they're trying to get, then it can be a huge scare tactic to keep people from dissenting in the future.
And no surprise, the 4-week trial was a complete sham, despite the fact that McMillan presented multiple pictures of her bruises. Nearly all the physical evidence was discounted, yet the police testimony was apparently considered infallible. Furthermore, the judge refused to admit evidence of Bovell's past behavior, which involved discipline problems within the department. Not to mention that he repeatedly identified the wrong eye when asked where McMillan had injured him. Unfortunately, this case signifies a justice system that's used to scare people into compliance. So if you want to see justice for the abusers and not the abused, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make it up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air that's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire we're told. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
The corrupting power of money in politics is as old as democracy itself. But over the last decade, campaign finance has exploded like never before. And today, U.S. elections are a multi-billion-dollar industry. According to the Federal Election Commission, 2012 saw candidates, parties, and outside groups spend a combined $7 billion, equivalent to the entire GDP of the country of Moldova. The system has put the electoral process into the hands of a minuscule amount of uber-wealthy individuals. But one man is standing up to big money in politics in the most ironic way possible, with big money in politics. Yes, on May 1st, renowned academic and Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig launched a crowd-funded super PAC that will invest in political candidates who promise to overturn the system of legalized bribery. Lessig's super PAC has already raised over $500,000 in just 5 days. And he joined me earlier to discuss it. I started by asking him to break down the 2 stages of modern elections.
Basically, what we've allowed to evolve in the American political system is the separation of 2 stages to get elected. The first stage, a candidate's got to spend an incredible amount of time raising money from a very tiny number of electors. We could call that the green primary. You've got to pass the green primary to be able to go on to the general election, where you obviously try to get the votes, and you try to get the votes from the widest range of Americans. Now, everyone participates in the general election, but the tiniest fraction of the 1% are the relevant voters in the green primary. And that 2-stage election, I think, creates a fundamental corruption of the political system, because we're supposed to have a democracy where we all are equally participants in that democracy.
And you've also said that the political system relies so heavily on campaign fundraising that it's led to politicians developing a sixth sense. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that concept.
Yeah, well, if you spend, any human who spends 30 to 70% of your time raising money from a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%, you can't help but develop an intuition about exactly what sorts of things you need to say to continue to succeed in raising money from those people and what sort of issues you need to avoid. So you begin to develop a sense, like the sixth sense, of what the range of appropriate issues to approach and to talk about and to push are if you're going to continue to be able to be successful to raise money from these funders.
Unfortunate, truly. Another major problem you've outlined is the revolving door between Capitol Hill and K Street. We know too well. If we take a look at this graph from the Sunlight Foundation, check this out. We've seen that from 1998 to 2012, lobbying revenue from lobbyists with government experience, keywords there, has grown over 400%. I mean, why has the revolving door system gotten so much worse in the last 2 decades?
Well, these things work together. So the lobbying system needs to be able to sell influence to its clients. That's what makes them valuable to clients. And in order to exercise that influence, lobbyists have to develop very close ties with people on Capitol Hill. Jack Abramoff, who of course is notorious as one of the ex-felon lobbyists, but now has become quite an important reformer, describes in his book the most important technique he had as a lobbyist was to approach a chief of staff, for example, at a Senate and say, "What are you doing in 2 years?" And the chief of staff would say, "I don't know." And he would say, "Well, when you're finished, I want you to look me up." And as Abramoff says, from that moment on, he owned that staffer and not a single dollar had changed hands. And that's because these staffers and members of Congress increasingly look to K Street, to where the lobbyists work, as a great opportunity for upping their income in some dramatic ways, so that they can have all the dreams that they had for their kids or for their houses without ever having to go to law school or to do anything like real people do to make money. So this becomes a system that feeds on itself, and everybody depends upon this system surviving, because if you change the way you funded elections, you would radically undermine the capacity of lobbyists to charge the amount of money they charge for their services.
And unfortunately, we're seeing a tremendous rise in unregistered lobbyists, making it harder and harder to kind of track what's going on here on the Hill. Lawrence, let's talk about another big blow for getting money out of politics that just happened, the McCutcheon versus FCC ruling from last month, abolishing aggregate campaign limits. How do we get to the point where equating money and speech has become legally justified?
Well, this idea, of course, is long-standing. More than almost 40 years ago now, the Supreme Court established this principle. And my own view is that principle isn't the problem. The problem is that the court has not allowed Congress to try to make sure that we didn't develop the kind of corrupt system of dependency on a small number of funders that, in fact, we have allowed to develop. And McCutcheon is just the latest in this series. So the Supreme Court has struck down aggregate limits. What that means is the business model of fundraising is going to change. Parties are going to look more and more to the super rich to be spending up to $3.6 million per super rich contributor so that they can fund a wider range of campaigns, and in that process further reduce the number of people who are actually contributing to campaigns. So this corruption of a tiny fraction participating in the green election will become even more extreme as the number of participants funding after McCutcheon continues to fall.
And I think this is just so overwhelming for people who are just completely disillusioned with the complete corruption as they see on Capitol Hill. Let's talk about solutions. Your proposed solution to the problem, you started your own crowdsourced super PAC at the beginning of the month called the Mayday PAC. Already have raised over $500,000 in 5 days. Incredible. What's the goal of the super PAC and how will it restore true representative democracy?
Well, the idea is that we could put together enough resources to win a change in Congress by 2016, to get a Congress who's committed to fundamental reform. And if we could pull those resources together, we could begin to have the impact on this system that's necessary, the kind of moonshot that's necessary to get this radical change through in such a short period of time. But to get there, we wanted to start in these incremental steps. So the first step is to raise money for 2014 so we can compete in 5 races in a very dramatic way to demonstrate why this message of reducing the influence of money in politics is so important and resonates with people so effectively. And to raise that money, we started this Kickstarter project where we say we're going to first raise $1 million in 30 days, and we'll get that matched, and then we'll raise another $5 million in 30 days. And those two Kickstarter rounds will bring us to the point that we can fund the initial 2014 campaign. And that's kind of a pilot for what we're going to do in 2016.
I love the innovation and I love the idea. However, the website says that you'll use the money to fund Democratic and Republican candidates that promise campaign finance reform. Why not consider alternatives, third-party candidates who seem to me much more likely to abandon the old ways of running campaigns?
Well, we've considered in this first 2014 race, we considered supporting independents, but as we looked around the country, we didn't actually see races where we were going to be able to make a substantial difference with an independent as a candidate. That, I hope we're wrong. I hope that proves to be wrong. But we were not eager to be raising money for losing causes. We're going to run in 5 races. We're going to win in 5 races. We're going to demonstrate in those 5 races that this issue matters to Americans. And if we have to benefit Democrats or Republicans, then so be it. The point is to build the recognition of why this is a critical issue that has to win.
I'm glad you have the mind open to consider that in the future, because considering how neither party has really followed through on real campaign finance reform, I don't know why we should continue to put our trust in them. Doesn't that kind of defeatism perpetuate the problem?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the biggest things. You know, we found in a poll that more than 90% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money in politics, but just about the same number of Americans don't think it's possible to reduce the influence of money in politics. And those two ideas together produce the politics of resignation that we see right now. And so what this Super PAC tries to do is to break that resignation, to thaw it, to give people a sense there is something you can do. And I agree with you, Democrats and Republicans have both participated in the currently corrupt system. And independents have basically been shut out, very few cases where they're actually able to participate competitively. But if we can change the system, then I think we could give opportunities to Democrats and Republicans to go back to arguing and advancing ideas on the basis of the principles of their parties, as opposed to the dollars that might come into their campaign if they take one issue, one side of one issue or the other.
Right, reminding them that they ultimately work for us, Lawrence. What a concept. Last week, Vermont became the first state to call for a federal constitutional convention to pass an amendment overturning the Citizens United and McCutcheon ruling. Do you think, I mean, what do you think about campaign finance being fought at the state rather than federal level?
Well, what Vermont did that was very important was it was the first state to call for an Article 5 convention, a convention where amendments could be proposed to address this issue of corruption in politics. There's probably between 22 and 26, depending on how you count it, states that have called for an Article 5 convention for conservative purposes, like to shrink the size of the federal government or to pass a balanced budget amendment. But this was the first state to do it on this issue of the corruption of money in politics. And I think you're going to see many more that do it. And I think that kind of state activism is actually incredibly important, because the closer we get to the magic number 34, which is the number of states necessary to actually force Congress to call an Article 5 convention, the more terrified Congress will be that there will be a convention, and the more eager they will be to pass the kind of reform that would staunch or slow the convention movement. So I think this is yet another strategy we've got to deploy. You know, we've got to be able to walk and chew gum and tweet at the same time. It's the only way we're going to take on this monolith in Washington that has developed this incredible institutional corruption of the way our political system works.
No doubt. Everyone check it out. May 1 Project. Lawrence Lessig, a Harvard professor. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks very much.
Coming up, I'll take a look at a state that's having an earthquake epidemic. Stay tuned.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
the media, the candidates, the corporatocracy. Covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the Set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
One of the most controversial practices in today's energy industry is a process known as hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Now, if this is the first time you're learning about fracking, here's a quick breakdown. It's a form of drilling for natural gas and shale rock that involves pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, chemicals, and sand into the ground. And while effective at extracting gas, the practice has been heavily criticized for a laundry list of damaging side effects to human health and the environment. Among them, an increased risk of earthquakes. Take Oklahoma, for example, a state not known for having any seismic activity. It reported a record 109 earthquakes measuring 3.0 or higher just last year. 109. And that record was broken within the first 4 months of this year. Because apparently the wind doesn't just blow in Oklahoma, the ground shakes as well, all thanks to deep underground drilling that apparently Mother Nature doesn't agree with. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey has added new measuring stations across the state to keep up with the quakes. And in a new report issued just this week, USGS scientists said that oil and natural gas drilling is a likely contributing factor to the quakes. You think? Aside from Oklahoma's earthquake outbreak, increased seismic activity has been reported in non-earthquake prone states such as Texas, Ohio, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, all believed to be linked to fracking. Of course, fracking isn't just leading to man-made earthquakes, though. The practice has been proven to be linked to birth defects and other human health ailments. In a groundbreaking victory, one family who's faced deteriorating health effects from groundwater poisoning linked to fracking won a $3 million lawsuit. But fighting the continued practice has been anything but easy. In fact, this story is 1 in a million, as fracking companies often go to great lengths to silence any opposition to their drilling. That's certainly the case of Vera Scroggins, a Pennsylvania anti-fracking activist who was legally banned from a number of public and private establishments in her hometown. The ban was issued by a local judge who sided with Cabot Oil, one of the biggest gas and energy companies in Pennsylvania, which also happens to own and lease properties in over 40% of the county where Scroggins lives. RT correspondent Marina Portnaya joined me earlier, and I first asked her to break down the latest on the case.
Well, Vera is a fearless and passionate activist, determined to shine the biggest spotlight possible on the fracking industry. You have to understand that for more than 5 years, she's been leading bus tours of the Marcellus Shale gas field in Montrose, Pennsylvania, showing visitors what fracking has done to her community. She has hosted Yoko Ono, Sean Lennon, Susan Sarandon, U.S. officials, as well as foreign officials. Now, this 63-year-old is also a citizen journalist. She's documented and uploaded over 400 videos exposing the consequences of fracking to YouTube, particularly focusing on the type of environmental damage it's causing. Why is it important to know this? Because Cabot Oil and Gas Corporation is one of the biggest drillers in Pennsylvania, and clearly the publicity Vera's been giving them is not flattering, to say the least. They wanted to silence her and shut her down. So in October, a court injunction brought in by the company restricted Vera from entering upon more than 300 square miles owned or leased by Cabot. This meant that she wasn't able to document what the company was doing, what kind of fracking was taking place. She wasn't even able to peacefully protest fracking in general. Now, according to reports, Cabot insisted that Vera's activism distracted their employees from working and interfered with natural gas production. The company also accused Vera of trespassing on their property. But as we know from my report, a judge recently scaled down that injunction. Right now, she just has to remain 100 feet away from any access roads or sites belonging to Cabot.
What kind of damages or environmental impacts have we seen fracking cause in her home state?
We have to understand that this type of fracking is being done next to homes, schools, farmland, on top of farmland. Many in the community are extremely concerned that the chemicals that are being pumped into the ground will eventually seep back up, go into the food that is being grown, ultimately sold to us, food that we are going to consume. So there's a lot of concerns that are being raised not just in Pennsylvania, throughout the country. You've been covering the story nonstop, but to see it up close in Pennsylvania to talk to Vera is quite telling on how concerning this circumstance is.
Definitely a lot more to be learned about the practice. Thanks so much for being on the ground doing just that, Marina. Really appreciate it. Here in D.C., there are lots of think tanks and pro-business activist groups that are responsible for pushing tons of disastrous policies. Perhaps no other organizations more responsible for as many damaging strategies as the American Legislative Exchange Council, better known as ALEC. This group has been the driving force in enacting some of the most conservative, backwards policies at a state level, from the now infamous stand your ground laws in states like Florida to voter ID laws that disproportionately target minorities. But that's not all. ALEC's attacks on the working class alone have amounted to over 100 anti-worker bills in 31 states just in the last few years. And now, a leaked internal document shows that ALEC is currently tracking 131 bills, which, among other things, aim to drastically scale back alternative energy standards, fossil fuel regulations, and combat opposition to the completion of the Keystone XL oil pipeline. So to discuss what's on the horizon for this shady organization, I'm joined by Brendan Fisher, staff counsel for the Center for Media and Democracy. Thank you so much for coming on, Brendan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So before we get into ALEC a little bit more, what does it mean that this organization's tracking 131 environmental bills? And talk a little bit about how these bills will affect the average American.
Sure. Well, so ALEC for decades has pushed these anti-environment deregulatory bills to benefit ALEC corporate members like Peabody Energy or Koch Industries. Why I think this bill tracking is really important, or the revelation of this bill tracking document is really important, is because ALEC has recently been denying that it tracks bills at all. And these denials may be motivated in part by a possible IRS investigation into ALEC. So ALEC is a charity. As a charity, not only do corporations get a tax write-off for paying ALEC to access and influence state legislators, they also are supposed to be engaged in minimal lobbying. By tracking all of these bills, it sure looks a lot like lobbying. So this could be a further indication that ALEC is in fact under an IRS investigation because their IRS status has been challenged by groups like Common Cause, Center for Media and Democracy, and others.
Super interesting. I know that the EPA recently won a huge Supreme Court case regarding coal regulations state to state across the country. As a result, of course, ALEC is launching a proactive campaign, pretty unprecedented actually in terms of their strategy switching over here. Can you talk about what new campaign they're going to launch to undermine the EPA?
Sure. Well, ALEC is no fan of the EPA. They have a publication called EPA's Regulatory Trainwreck. They've been after the EPA for years. What they do is try and get state legislation enacted, urging Congress to not allow the EPA to regulate coal companies or utility companies. Their latest tactic, though, is actually moving from the legislative branch to the executive branch. What they're doing is trying to coordinate state attorney generals to sue the EPA, to stop these new proposed rules regulating coal-fired power plants. They had a conference call back in January with John Bruning, who's Nebraska's Attorney General. John Bruning has gotten hundreds of thousands of dollars from coal interests and from energy interests. When he ran for U.S. Senate in 2012, he had a single fundraiser organized by Murray Coal's CEO and raised over $100,000. And now he's at the forefront of these lawsuits against the EPA. And what this really means is that state attorney generals are almost acting as taxpayer-funded law firms for energy interests. They're acting basically on behalf of Peabody Energy on behalf of American Electric Power and bringing these lawsuits using taxpayer funds to stop these reasonable efforts to thwart or to limit the efforts of climate change.
It's outrageous. I mean, it's really an outrageous maneuver here. I know that they just met in Kansas City. Of course, they had a lot of people protesting that. Is there new kind of front of what we just discussed, what they pushed in Kansas City, this kind of new environmental assault? Was that their main policy prescriptions?
Well,
there?
ALEC has 9 task forces. The Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force actually did organize a trip to a coal-fired power plant outside of Kansas City. They also had a number of EPA-related items on the agenda, but there's 9 different task forces. They also are pushing efforts to privatize education, to crack down on unions, to limit union power, and to also drastically cut income taxes.
It's amazing to see the worst of the worst legislation really all comes back to ALEC. It's amazing how much they've been able to succeed. And according to governing.com, about 1,000 bills based on ALEC's language are introduced every year. On average, about 20% get enacted. I mean, how does this compare to other think tanks? Do they just have how do they have such enormous success in enacting these bills?
Yeah, it is really incredible that so many bills are able to get introduced and passed every year. It's testament to ALEC's power. It's testament to that's the reason why corporations continue to fund ALEC despite public outcry. ALEC has lost a lot of corporate members over the last few years as the spotlight has begun to shine on the organization. But many corporations still fund ALEC. They still find it worth their dollars to fund ALEC, and in large part it's because it's so successful. It allows corporations to access and influence state legislators, and on top of that, they get a tax write-off for it because ALEC is a charity.
I mean, is that unique in its model to have corporations actually vote with legislators here? How is that legal?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other organization that allows that to happen. Corporations and legislators get an equal vote to adopt ALEC model legislation, and if the corporate members of ALEC don't like a bill, it doesn't move forward. So ALEC has tried to rebrand itself as a legislator-driven organization, but all evidence is to the contrary.
Yeah, obviously. And I know the Koch brothers, of course, are huge backers of ALEC. We have about a minute left, but I wanted you to kind of point out some of these other corporate donors behind the organization.
Sure. So the Kochs have been involved for a long time. They got the ALEC Adam Smith Free Enterprise Award back in the 90s. Peabody Energy is also a big ALEC member, as well as BP, ExxonMobil, a lot of the tobacco companies. Enjoy, the electronic cigarette manufacturer, just joined ALEC last year, according to internal documents leaked to The Guardian. And lo and behold, at the latest ALEC meeting, there's a presentation on regulating electronic cigarettes. And it was titled Regulating Electronic Cigarettes Jeffersonian Style.
Jeffersonian style, yeah, ALEC style. Thank you so much for keeping an eye on this horrendous organization. Brendan, really appreciate you coming on.
All right, thank you.
The country of Moldova. The system has put the electoral process into the hands of a minuscule amount of uber wealthy individuals. But one man is standing up to big money in politics in the most ironic way possible, with big money in politics. Yes, on May 1st, renowned academic and Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig launched a crowd-funded super PAC that will invest in political candidates who promise to overturn the system of legalized bribery. Lessig's super PAC has already raised over $500,000 in just 5 days. And he joined me earlier to discuss it. I started by asking him to break down the 2 stages of modern elections.
Basically, what we've allowed to evolve in the American political system is the separation of 2 stages to get elected. The first stage, a candidate's got to spend an incredible amount of time raising money from a...
We're about to do that you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
The corrupting power of money in politics is as old as democracy itself. But over the last decade, campaign finance has exploded like never before. And today, U.S. elections are a multi-billion-dollar industry. According According to the Federal Election Commission, 2012 saw candidates, parties, and outside groups spend a combined $7 billion, equivalent to the entire GDP of bruises. Nearly all the physical evidence was discounted, yet the police testimony was apparently considered infallible. Furthermore, the judge refused to admit evidence of Bovel's past behavior, which involved discipline problems within the department. Not to mention that he repeatedly identified the wrong eye when asked where McMillan had injured him. Unfortunately, this case signifies a justice system that's used to scare people into compliance. So if you want to see justice for the abusers and not the abused, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make it up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air that's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch.
What's going on, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So yesterday saw a major blow to those who still believe the U.S. doesn't have a two-tiered justice system. See, despite the fact that not a single banker faced trial for their role in the 2009 financial crisis, nearly 8,000 activists were arrested during the Occupy protests. Now, most of those charges were eventually dropped, but one activist named Cecily McMillan wasn't so lucky. According to McMillan, on the night of March 17, 2012, her breast was grabbed from behind by a police officer named Grantley Bovell. She instinctively responded by elbowing Bovell in the face and shortly suffered a seizure, as shown in the video. Shortly thereafter, rather. Well, after an absurdly long, drawn-out process, yesterday, McMillan was found guilty of second-degree assault, meaning that she could face up to 7 years in prison. Back in February, two of Cecily's supporters came on the show to discuss why the city of New York had invested so much time and money in the case and what a guilty verdict would mean.
Really what they're trying to do, at least in my belief, is show that you can't really protest legally anymore. Like, you really can't go to a protest and be safe. Which is really scary. So if they could successfully put Cecily in jail for the 2 to 7 years that they're trying to get, then it can be a huge scare tactic to keep people from dissenting in the future.
And no surprise, the 4-week trial was a complete sham, despite the fact that McMillan presented multiple pictures of her